All right. Audio is on, I think, now. Yes. Hello. Yes. Hi, Leslie. Good to see you. There we go. Now you should be able to hear me. I forgot to turn my mic on. The little light was on, and so I just forgot. It's still glitching. It was really glitchy last week, and I thought I had solved the problem. Apparently not. Okay, cool. Fantastic. I got about 4 minutes till people will probably start arriving. Kelly, you can't sit there. You're out of camera. Don't you wanna be in the video? If you scoot down just like a tiny bit. Yeah. If you're just like here, then you'll be in the video. Or that works too, I guess. Hello. Ugh. She's like, I can sit directly on your lap and then I'll be in the video. Very true. Hello. Okay. Hello. You're looking at me like I've done something terrible to you. Hello. This is my cat. She's very beautiful and I love her very much. She does not like to be held. Trying to see what is in the background of my house. It's hard to tell, which is okay. Move this. Well, actually, so we can leave it there. She's great. I love her very much. All right. The first couple minutes of this is always just boring because it's just me trying to remember, trying to make sure that all of this stuff is turned on, the camera and the video and everything. Okay. This is not mine. I'm mad that this is still glitching. That did not help. Hey, Mom. So I looked into the glitching and I thought I got it to stop, but apparently it is not something wrong with the camera. It is something wrong with my actual computer, because it is a normal occurrence for a bunch of other people with my laptop, that the camera just glitches like this. And if you push on the frame, it stops doing it as much until it like loosens up again. So it's something in like the wiring of the screen and camera that has caused the glitching. And that's very annoying to me. So see, it's like not as bad if I'm pushing on the screen. And then if I let go, it's like freaks out again. We will do our best. All right. It is exactly 8 o'clock. I think we're going to get through these chapters no problem, but every week I say I'm going to try to start earlier than the week before, and every week I do not start earlier than the week before. Yeah, apparently I cannot live stream from my phone because I did check this. So I either have to have like an external camera that can connect to my computer, which I currently do not, or I have to use my webcam. And I may, if I continue this Tuesday reading thing, which I might, I think I'm going to need to just buy a little external webcam. Even if the quality's not great, at least it won't do this. because this is very annoying. But I like the live streaming. I like reading. Stop. Stop. No. Oh well. Hello everybody. How's everybody doing? Just chilling. I keep trying different angles with my couch. I need to end up back in my room because I feel like reading from my desk was just a better ambiance than from my couch, but you can see all the stuff on my counter back here when I read from my couch. I don't want everyone paying attention to that. All right, it is 8:02. I'm going to try to start at 8:05. We'll see how that goes. All right, I got 4 people here. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the final night. I posted on Facebook and I said, well, we're going to find out if I cry at the end, because my teacher who read us this book famously cried at everything all the time, whether it was happy or it was sad. That was like her like comfortable expression of emotion was to cry, which we always thought was really like, we were like, that's weird when we were kids. But the ending of this is very sweet. And I reread the book like in preparation for reading it out loud, just so I wouldn't be like stumped by anything. Hopefully. And I definitely cried at the end when I reread it. But because it's been so recent, I don't know if I will cry at the end as I read it. I'm just gonna, if it comes, it comes, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. It's okay. But it's a very nice ending. Spoilers, the children's book ends happily. But yeah, we'll see. I think one of the Miss White would quite often cry at all books. But we had a series of books that we read called R.B. Jenkins, and I truly could not tell you what they were about. I know they played baseball. That's all I remember. They were like a Christian children's book series. I have them all in my room. And I remember that they played baseball. But whatever, there was one book where something like we considered to be like very unimportant in the grand story happened, and it was just like something that was like lovely, and Miss White just cried at the lovely thing, and we were like, okay, I guess. But she just, anything that made her heart feel tender, she would cry. And looking back now, I'm like, that's very nice. That's very nice that she was very in touch with her emotions, and wasn't afraid to like express those in front of us. But at the time, we're kids, so we're like, that's weird. Why does our teacher keep crying? Yeah, I remember one time, it was not because she had cried, it was because she was sick, but she let me read, we had like a lesson that we had to go through that day, and she was just going to read a passage from like the teacher's book. And she was sick that day, so she like couldn't read it. So she asked, well, I think I asked if she wanted me to read it because I was that kid. And she was like, sure. So I read it for the class. And the kids afterwards were like, if Miss White had, like, you did a good job, but if Miss White had read it, she would have cried and you did not cry. I was like, that is true. This is correct. Okay, let's see. It is 8:05. I'm going to go ahead and get started. We might gain a couple people along the way here, but as always, the full thing will be posted afterwards. Let me give a real quick recap in case anyone was not here, because I know Leslie is joining us. I don't think that this is one of my students. I don't think that she has read the whole story. So I'm going to give a really quick recap of the story just in case anyone has not been following along. So we have followed our 5 heroes. Muggles is our main character. Minji, who was the town moneykeeper, and then the three characters who were referred to in the beginning of the book as them, which is Curly Green, who's an artist, Gummy, who is a poet, and Walter the Earl, who is a historian. The three of them are quite different than the rest of the town of Slipper on the Water, which is where they live, because they don't quite conform with the status quo. Most mini pins are very specific. They have a very specific way of doing things. There's a group of mini pins called the Periods, whose names all are abbreviations that they think are names. Because there was this guy named Foolie the Balloonist, who is the only person to ever leave the valley. And he came back with this book full of information, but he hit his head on the way down, or so the story goes. And so he couldn't remember what any of the information was. Walter the Earl finds out he was just dumb. He just didn't know what he was talking about. So his wife incorrectly translated all of this information. And so now those people who are related to him are now sort of like the heads of the town, including the town mayor, Litted, which is LTD. So the five outlaws do various things throughout the beginning of the story to get themselves eventually kicked out of town. And they have traveled to the Knoll, which is where Gummy has a second house. And they've begun the process of building another house there so that all of them can live there. Muggles has very much taken charge. She's thought of as very simple in the village. And in fact, she's actually quite responsible, quite a good, a very hard worker, very good at planning and managing. But she was just never given that opportunity in the village because she's not a period. So now that she is out there, she's kind of realized that she is an important part of, the world and what's going on around her. She went back to the town with Gummy to pick up some things, told off the mayor, which was a big character moment for her. And now we have gone up to the mines and we've discovered that there is a group of bad guys known as the Mushrooms who are coming through the mountain, through the old mines, and they're about to attack Slipper on the Water and all of the other villages in the valley. Slipper on the Water is currently getting ready for a judging competition where one of the villages in the valley is going to get the Gammage Cup, hence the name of the book, which is a cup that the founder of all of the villages left at the end of the road. Let's see. So Walter the Earl has gone back to town to try to rally the villagers. That seems like it's going well. He's got a big group of them around one of the mini pins houses that he's about to give a big speech to. Minji has gotten himself kidnapped by the Mushrooms, so he is currently trying to figure out a way to trap them in the valley so that he does not have to, so that they aren't able to escape and then come back later. But he is severely injured currently. And Gummy has gotten shot with a poison arrow. Oh, I'm sorry, hit with a poison spear. And he is currently also dying. Muggles and Curly Green are attempting to keep him alive while also protecting him, while also actively being attacked by mushrooms in this, not the fully built house, but the only partially built house that they have on the knoll, which does not have a roof or windows and doors, just walls. So there are two doors and a window. We will get to that. So yeah, that is where we left off our characters. We left each of our main characters there. And we are going to go ahead and pick back up. For anyone just joining, I will do my little rundown. I am reading The Gammage Cup. We are finishing The Gammage Cup, actually, today. I am reading it for my 6th grade teacher who passed away in December. This was one of her favorite books. She read this book to every single class. It was my class's favorite book as well, and has continued to be a favorite of mine. And yeah, I'm just reading it in her honor to, kind of preserve her memory a little bit for myself, and for everyone else who, enjoyed this book as well when they were in her class. So thank you all for joining me. We are going to get started with chapter 21. The turtle whose head is within its shell thinks the world outside is going well. Gummy scribbles collected works. 5 reed lights flared red and orange in the marketplace of Slipper on the Water, and the cobblestones resounded with the pat pat of hurrying feet. From the west side of the square came the clink of armor as it was brought out of Walter the Earl's vault and piled in heaps under his family tree. Figures emerged from other cottages, burdened with blankets and pots of soup, hampers of food and cooking utensils, which they carried down to the dock to be loaded into the boats. In Foley Hall, the children were tearing sheets into strips for bandages. Overall drifted the aroma of freshly baked bread from loafs' ovens. His war cloak flashing 1,000 winking fires, Walter the Earl hurried from one spot to another, directing operations, exhorting the villagers to greater speed. And while he strode the cobbles, he instructed Crambo, his appointed second in command, in the ancient art of warfare. But all the time he kept a careful eye on the small knot of periods gathered around the center lamppost. Other periods either stayed sullenly in their own houses or, like women Geo, wandered about, making jeering remarks at the busy villagers. But so far, these four, Litted, Co, Bros, and Ect, had done nothing but stand watch over the marketplace. It was unnerving, that silent gaze. Minipins were giving the four periods a wide berth as they passed. When Reedy reported that the last of the food and other supplies had been delivered to the dock, Walter the Earl sent word to Fisher and his 7 boatmen to finish loading the craft and embark at once. Then he signaled Thrum to summon the villagers to the west side of the square. Before the double blast of the trumpet had died away, Minipins started streaming across the cobblestones. After a moment's hesitation, the four periods at the lamppost, though holding themselves aloof from the throng, moved in the same direction. Walter the Earl frowned uneasily and turned to Crambo, who was arming himself. "Get everybody lined up, and we'll pick our 50 at once. As soon as they are in armor, we'll march." He looked toward the mountains dimly outlined against the dark sky. "We'll go across the meadow to the little trickle and follow it to the knoll. Fast-paced all the way." Crambo, fastening his war cloak, was already bawling at the villagers to form a line. But suddenly, reluctant, they hung back, their eyes fastened on something beyond Crambo and Walter the Earl. The four periods had drawn themselves up in their own line facing the villagers, daring them to go further. "Never mind the line," Walter the Earl said. "We'll start right away." He walked swiftly past the small huddles, counting out his army of 50. Eyes shifted, feet shuffled, but Crambo hauled out the chosen ones and set them aside to array themselves in armor. Walter the Earl hesitated before Geo and Wim, who were on either side of Thatch, held there by the roofer's steel grip. Then he called out their names and Thatch's and started on. "Stop!" Litted stood forth. "No period goes on this fool's errand." Every minipin in the square froze. Walter the Earl stepped swiftly in front of the mayor. "Periods are minipins like the rest of us. Give them armor, Crambo." "I am still the mayor of this village, and I say that Geo and Wim stay here. I further must warn you that every minipin who goes on this night's journey will pay a fine before he is allowed to return." Crambo weighed first one foot and then the other, while all around him the villagers edged away from Litted's angry beard. Walter the Earl cast a desperate look at his army of 50, arrested in the very motions of donning their armor. He faced the mayor squarely. "Geo and Wim go with us," he said. "They belong to the village, and the village has voted to go to the mountains." "Are you quite sure?" Co asked with a sneer. He pointed to where the new warriors were standing beside the piles of armor. They were making no attempt to dress themselves, and some who had been in the act of strapping on the metal pieces began uncertainly to unstrap. Litted raised his persuasive voice. "Good folk, return to your homes and your warm beds. You have only to look toward the mountain to see that all is peaceful there. The invaders exist only in Walter the Earl's mind, deranged from living apart from the village. Forget the alarms of this day. You were wrong to take action into your own hands, but we are ready to forgive." Walter the Earl half drew his sword. "Wait." Grimly, he stared into the doubtful faces. "What you do in the next hour, in the next minute, means life or death to the whole Minipin race." Minipins muttered and stirred and shifted in their places. "Crambo," Walter the Earl said quietly, "go ahead with the arming." Crambo nervously plucked at the fastenings of his war cloak. The mini pins who had already turned away turned back to see what he would do. A waiting hush fell over the marketplace. Then, into the hush, throbbed the sound, an unearthly, deep-throated murmur, borne on the night wind from the direction of the mountains. For an instant, there wasn't a flicker of movement in the square. The sound came again, louder, deeper, and there was death in the cry. "The invaders!" Walter the Earl pulled out his sword. "Sound the trumpet! To arms!" At Thrum's blast, the square came furiously alive. Armor was snatched up. A dozen hands helped each warrior to array himself. Crambo counted out the last of the 50, and they scrambled into the remaining metal suits. Walter the Earl turned to Litted, whose face was suddenly drawn. "We need a medical band. Will you lead it?" "I?" Litted looked around in bewilderment. But, but I... Yes or no?" "Yes," Litted whispered. 50 jeweled war cloaks winked in the fire of the torches as Walter the Earl took his place at the head of the army. Behind him, Thrum and Dingle the Miller had aloft the long trumpets from which floated battle flags of scarlet and gold. Crambo came running up to report that all was ready. Walter the Earl thrust his sword into the air. "Sound the trumpets! Advance the host! Death to the invaders!" "Death to the invaders!" came the answering roar. The trumpets exploded with an ear-splitting sound. With a fast-marching step, the army of 50 moved down the small road going nowhere. Chapter 22. When the magic in the sword burns its white-hot light, then the awful cry of kin-death turns to shrieking, weaking fright. But when the magic flickers and the light grows pale, then a fearful cry of kin-death tears the night like hail. Gummy Scribbles Collected Works. When Gummy gave his sudden wild cry and flung himself from his bed, Muggles screamed, "Get back! You'll be hit!" But Gummy leaped for the doorway and snatched the sword from its hanging. Instantly, it flamed into blue-white light that snapped and crackled until the night was as bright as day. But Gummy was fully exposed to the mushroom's deadly spears. With a cry, Muggles threw herself at him, and they went tumbling to the floor just as 3 spears winged harmlessly over the spot where he had been standing a moment before. "Weak, weak, weak!" cried the voices of the mushrooms in the night, but they sounded close. "Weak, weak!" Their voices were moving around to the other side of the stone walls, away from the doorway. "Help me," Curly Green said faintly, struggling with her comforter. Muggles left Gummy slumped in a corner out of harm's way, the dazzling sword still clutched in his fingers, and darted across to Curly Green. 2 spears had landed, one on either side of her, pinning the comforter to the floor. "Are you hurt?" cried Muggles, tugging at the embedded spears. "No, what's happened? Never mind. Kin death, kin death." A spear hurtled through the window frame over their heads and hissed across the room through the doorway on the other side. Muggles ripped the comforter free with a shower of feathers. "Quick!" she cried. "We must get the swords!" She sprang to the window to tear down the lifeless weapons. As her hand touched the hilt, the blade's sudden brilliant flare blinded her for a moment, and she staggered back just as another spear whanged past her head and landed with a stone-splintering crash against a wall. "Weak! Weak! Weak!" "Armor!" gasped Curly Green. "We must put on armor!" She had pulled down the 3rd sword and was crouching under the back window, holding it aloft. The "weeks" became fainter in that direction, but now they were circling around to the doorway again. "Gummy!" Muggles shouted. "Wake up! Put your sword across the doorway!" Gummy's eyes flickered open in his white face, and he stared at her as though he had never seen her before. Muggles stamped her foot. "Gummy, you must wake up! Do you hear? Wake up! Put your sword across the door still!" The faintest flutter of understanding crossed his face, and he smiled gently. With a tremendous effort, he pushed himself forward and then fell flat, the sword stretched out before him across the doorway like a line of fire. "Keep your sword up and I'll dress you," Muggles ordered Curly Green. She dragged 2 leg pieces toward her and began the torturous task. "Kin death! Kin death!" Spears whizzed through the unprotected windows. "Kin death! Kin death! Kin death!" "They're coming closer," whispered Curly Green. "We'll have to think of something." "Hold still," Muggles answered. "Here's your helmet." It slipped into place with a clang. One of the spears angled through the window and rasped along the side of Curly Green's armored leg. "Now," cried Muggles, "let's each take a side window and drive them off." She snatched up her sword from the floor, closing her eyes for an instant against the blinding light, and ran across the room, while Curly Green left the back window and darted to the opening opposite Muggles. The cries immediately grew fainter at the sides of the house, but louder in the back. Before any spears came through that window, Curly Green was there defending it. Muggles dropped her sword and began pulling and pushing herself into the second suit of armor. But before she was dressed, she had to snatch up the sword again and defend one of the side windows, while Curly Green took the other. "How long do you think it will take Walter the Earl to come?" asked Curly Green, breathing fast after two more dashes, between which Muggles managed to get into the rest of her armor. "Don't count on him until morning," Muggles panted. "We must think of something," said Curly Green. "We can't keep running back and forth between windows all night." "You think of something while I do something about Gummy." Muggles turned to the still form stretched out on the floor. It would be hard to put armor on him, limp as he was, but he was in danger each time they had to leave the back window unguarded while they drove the mushrooms away from the sides. A stray spear might find his body at any moment. The shields! She snatched up two of them and dragged them across the floor, but as she started to cover him, her eyes passed over that brave sword stretched across the doorway. It was flickering, dying out. "Gummy!" she choked, giving him a little shake. His face was white as birch bark. She put her hand on the hilt of the sword beside Gummy's relaxed grip. The blade flared anew, but when she took her hand away, it faded again. "Gummy! Oh, Gummy!" Heedless of the spears now coming through the side windows, she darted across the room to get the pot of ointment and the willow brew. Feverishly, she rolled Gummy onto his back, stripped the bandage and poultice from his shoulder, and slapped the remaining ointment in its place, with the willow leaves on top. But the sword still only flickered feebly. "Weak! Weak!" The mushrooms had worked around to the front again with the dying of the sword. Muggles laid her hand on the hilt and watched the flame leap into the blade until its golden letters shimmered. A last spear flashed through the doorway as the whimpering voices faded away from the front of the shelter. It sped across the room and clanged against Curly Green's helmet. With an anguished cry, Curly Green fell senseless on the floor. Her sword clattered into a corner, and slowly the light dimmed. "Weak! Weak! Kin death! Kin death! Kin death!" The voices were closing in. Chapter 23. One wood mouse can nibble a large hole. Muggles' maxims. Minji was coming to the end of his pondering. The problem was, after all, very simple. Since he couldn't help raise an army or carry one of the swords against the mushrooms, he would have to wage a one-mini-pin war of his own from inside the mountain. His job was to keep the mushrooms from escaping through the old mine. He could only hope that the villagers of Slipper on the Water were on their way. Very well, then. He must use the materials at hand. He looked about the great cavernous room. Huge piles of woven mats were arranged along the side. Sleeping mats? If the mushrooms were persuaded back into the old mine and found their way into the cavern blocked by those mats, what good would that do? Not much, Minji decided. They would simply move the mats and come storming onward. A few more might be slain if the mini-pins followed them into the mine, but most of them would get through. Minji let his eyes rove farther, but there was little more to be seen except for the candles guttering low in their holders on the walls. Candles. Mats. Minji scratched the tip of his nose and let a slow smile creep over his face. Would the long passage leading upward to the open air act as a sort of chimney? He thought it would. So he'd better get up off his lazy haunches and set to work. He wiggled his foot experimentally. It wiggled. Then he hoisted himself up and tried his weight on it. That was not so good. The white stuff had all worked in. He reached into the metal pot and helped himself to more of the healing salve. When he got out of here, that pot must go with him. Hobbling over to the nearest stack of mats, he lifted two of them. His nose wrinkled in disgust at the smell of the things. These mushrooms would never work themselves to death washing. Pulling the mats behind him, he limped toward the entrance leading to the land between the mountains and threw them down a few feet along the passage. Then he went back to the heap and got two more mats to add to the first two. He stopped to listen, but there was no sound anywhere under the mountain. If there were guards, they would be posted at the mine's entrance, and even their keen ears could not hear him so far away. Then he went back to the heap and got two more mats. It was like the nursery tale the Minipin children wanted to hear over and over again. And then another frog hopped down the bank and got another green buzzfly. He said it over to himself with every trip across the floor. His foot began to pain him with each step he took, but he went on, back and forth, back and forth. And when the mouth of the tunnel was completely full, he still carried mats to stack alongside. There must be no lack of smoke for want of fuel, he chuckled to himself. But at last he couldn't manage another mat. He made a final trip to get his packet of food, almost empty now, the pot of white stuff, and the 2 candles. Then he settled himself beside his stack of mats in the tunnel to wait and listen, and eat the rest of his bread and fish cakes. Okay, now take a little drink. All right. Chapter 24. The ringing clash as the bright sword slash goes pealing through the night, and the mushrooms wail as they quake and quail, brightens the sword's white light. The song is loud of the warriors proud who wield the sword that bites. They seal the doom of the fleeting mushroom, and they strike in a cause that's right. Gummy scribbles collected works. Walter the Earl marched his men fast and faster along the bank of the little trickle, but it was dark, and unaccustomed as they were to any kind of walking except over familiar cobblestones in the daylight, they stumbled and fell behind, and ran to catch up, and stumbled again. Light the torches, went the order back through the straggling lines, and in a moment a dozen reed lights flared in the hands of the warriors. Then the march was speeded up until Finn and Spill, with the medical band in the rear, could scarcely keep pace. Lean on me, Littid told Finn through clenched teeth, and Ko took Spill's arm to help him forward. At the front of the line, Walter the Earl kept his eyes alert for trouble. Was there a dim radiance there ahead of them where the knoll should be? He felt his sword blade, but it remained cold under his touch. Now Walter the Earl was sure that he could see a brightness through the trees, and he urged his men forward. They broke into a half-trot, their jeweled cloaks swinging and glittering in the torch flares. Beside Thatch, Wim ran silently, save for the sharp whistle of his breath through his teeth. The sound which had come borne on the wind from the direction of the mountains had badly shaken him. Now he was almost willing to believe Walter the Earl's story. He clutched tighter the ugly blackened sword that had been put into his hand, the sword that was supposed to flash with brilliant light upon the approach of the mushrooms. Not that he put any faith in that part of the tale for an instant, but it was a comfort to hold on to something. On the other side of Thatch, Geo tripped over the sword which he had tied to his belt, and would have gone sprawling had not the powerful roofer reached out an arm to support him. Thanks, Geo said, in as cold a voice as he could muster from his gasping lungs. The near fall had jarred every bone in his body. How could anybody be expected to jog all night long, lugging a bar of iron so heavy he wouldn't be able to lift it at the end of the journey? The sword caught him between the legs again, but this time he regained his balance without Thatch's clumsy help. That was enough. Here was one sword that was going no farther this night. Still trotting along, he managed to lag behind Thatch's bulk while he unfastened the sword from his belt. Then, holding it in the readiness to pitch it into the next convenient patch of undergrowth, he accidentally touched the blade. Halt! Cried Walter the Earl's voice from up ahead. Geo stumbled into the mini-pin ahead of him, but he scarcely noticed. The blade. The blade was warm in his hand and beginning to glow with an inner light. Awed, Geo raised his eyes and a chill swept over him. Beyond the flaring torches and the army of 50, high above them, the night sky glowed with light. Now that the army had stopped, he could hear a faint high wailing sound, coupled with an even more ominous lower tone that chanted over and over, Kin death, kin death. Geo's faltering hand encountered Thatch's arm, and he clutched the strength of it, as though some of that power might flow into his own body. Crambo came running back along the staggering lines. Everybody forward for orders! Make haste! Alongside, the waiting boats had pulled in. Boatmen chucked out medical supplies and scrambled ashore to join Littid's band. Walter the Earl strode into the midst of his army. The mushrooms are on the knoll, he said. Weak! Weak! Came the whine of the invaders, mixed with the savage cries of, Kin death! The army stirred restlessly. We shall try to surround them, but there may not be time, for we don't know what desperate straits our people are in. Crambo and 10 warriors will start to circle the base of the knoll immediately. They will take Dingle the trumpeter with them. Then Brush and his 10 will follow a few minutes later. Drug and his company go next. The rest will stay with me, including Thumb the trumpeter. I will give you as much time as I can to get into position around the knoll. Thrum will blast the signal for attack. You will answer. Dingle on your trumpet. No matter where you are, spread out and charge up the knoll. Cut the mushrooms down without mercy, but beware of their spears. Is all understood?" "Yes," they all answered in a hoarse, gasping shout. "Good. Remember that we want to trap them on the knoll. If they run for the mountain, do not follow until I give the order. We must all fight together. Crambo, we're ready. Then off you go. Good speed." Crambo and his 10 warriors and Dingle the trumpeter melted into the darkness at the right, their single torch quickly lost within the trees. In 2 minutes' time, Walter the Earl sent Brush the cobble sweeper on his way, and after a further wait, Drug the craftsman started with his company. Walter the Earl kept his eyes fastened on the knoll. Though he couldn't actually see the houses on the top from where he stood, the swords of the outlaws gave enough light to reveal flitting figures about the edge of the flat-topped hill. His eyes began to ache from the strain, but it was not yet time to give the signal for attack. Crambo must work his way around to the other side. Then they all heard the anguished cry. The light from above dimmed. Instantly, the high whine changed in key, was drowned out by 100 throats shouting, "Kin death! Kin death!" "Sound the trumpet!" Walter the Earl shouted. Thrum gave a mighty blast. The warriors surged forward up the knoll, Walter the Earl at their head. From the far side, Dingle's trumpet answered. There was a fierce battle cry from 50 mini-pin throats. Armor clinked and rattled as the warriors raced up the hill. Torches were cast aside to sputter in the grass. Swords began to glimmer and then glow. The shouts of "Kin death!" stuttered into startled silence, to be replaced with "Weak! Weak!" The shadowy figures closing in on the stone house stopped and turned in confusion. There was a whistle of spears launched at the mini-pin host. Then the mushrooms began to run before the swords that were bursting into flame all around the knoll. They were heading for the roofless stone house. But suddenly, the dimming light from the stone house flashed brilliant blue-white sparks, and Walter the Earl's heart leaped. A cluster of swords rose slowly above the roofless walls, showering fountains of light. The mushrooms fled in terror about the edges of the knoll, seeking a way out from the dread swords almost encircling them. With a roar, Walter the Earl's men topped the rise. Spears rang against their shields and armor. There was a groan from one of the mini-pins, and he fell, a spear in his side where his armor was imperfectly fastened. On the other, warriors rushed, leaving their companion in the care of Litid, who, disregarding the flying weapons, knelt beside the stricken one to minister to him. In a moment, the whole hilltop was a circle of flaming swords, except for the side going down to the little trickle. Mushrooms fled toward that spot, but the swords pursued them, cutting and hacking and slashing. The night was alive with flame and shouts and shrieks and groans. Walter the Earl cut his way through three mushrooms as he charged toward the roofless house, which was spouting blue-white fire. He burst through the door and stopped short. Gummy lay to his right, his sword flickering feebly in his hand. Against the opposite wall, straining to hold the 4 swords high, Muggles teetered precariously on a mound built of shields, comforters, and, on top, between Muggles' feet, the limp form of Curly Green. "They're still alive," Muggles gasped, the swords wavering in her hands. "Curly Green, stunned, but blow on the head. This was the only way I could—" Co came running in. "They're cleared from the knoll," he cried, "but they're running down the little trickle. I'll take over here." With a nod, Walter the Earl was out the door. The last of the mushrooms were pouring out over the edge of the knoll, down toward the stream below. "After them!" he shouted. "Sound the trumpets!" Litid came running up to report. 5 of our men wounded, none dead. Spill popped up beside him. 67 dead mushrooms counted. "Right," said Walter the Earl. Then the trumpet sounded, and he swung his sword in a flashing circle over his head. "Advance the host! Death to the invaders!" "Death to the invaders!" came the ringing shout from all sides. The mini-pin warriors poured over the lip of the knoll after the fleeing mushrooms. Chapter 25. Where there's fire, there's smoke. Muggles, maxims. At first, the valiant army of 50 seemed to be gaining on the mushrooms, for their terrified whimpering sounded loud throughout the night, but gradually the "weeks" grew fainter as the hairless ones drew ahead. The mini-pins had marched far, their armor hampered them, and even the swords, which had seemed almost to carry themselves flaming through the night, felt heavy in their hands. On before them, always out of reach, fled the hairless ones. An occasional spear still hissed through the air. Here and there a mini-pin went down, but his companions struggled on. By the time that Minji's rock came in sight, the mini-pins were staggering and falling in exhaustion. "Faster!" shouted Walter the Earl desperately. "Faster! Cut them down before they reach the mountain!" The stumblers drove themselves onward at his call, but it was to no avail. When they poured around Minji's rock, they saw the mushrooms disappearing into the old mine. Two guards at the entrance hurled spear after spear into the Minipin host until the last of the mushrooms were inside. Then the guards turned and were swallowed up with the rest. "Halt!" Walter the Earl cried in despair. The warriors fell in their tracks and lay groaning. The gold letters shimmered, bright if the cause is right, for a few moments longer, and then began to fade. Litted, at the head of his medical band, arrived and immediately began bustling about amid the weary army. But Walter the Earl strode tirelessly up and down before the entrance of the mine, sword in hand. Those nearest him turned away from the terrible look on his haggard face. In the east, the sky was beginning to lighten with the coming of day. "Any sign of Minji?" asked Litted of Geo, who was slumped against the big rock next to Thatch. Geo shook his head. "No sign at all. Likely he's..." But Geo didn't finish the thought. Walter the Earl wouldn't let anybody go in after him. Said we would all be picked off by the spears. Walter the Earl is... Litted began hesitantly. "That is to say, he has led the army well tonight." Brush, who had flopped down close to the mine's entrance, suddenly lifted his head and sniffed. "I smell smoke. It's coming from the tunnel," yelled Dingle, pointing. At first they could see only wisps floating out into the gray light of the dawn, and then the wisps became plumes that wreathed in the air and disappeared. "Listen!" cried Crambo, and the clanking of armor ceased. Faintly to their ears came, "Weak! Weak! Weak!" "They're coming back!" Walter the Earl shouted. "Stand out of the way of the spears. Crambo and Drug, your men on that side. Brush over here with me. Litted, take your folk behind the big rock. Look to your swords." A ragged cheer went up. The blades were glowing brighter and brighter. Warriors scattered to the left and right of the old mine entrance, which now belched great gouts of smoke, evil-smelling smoke that made the warriors cough when it blew among them. "Phew," Crambo muttered. "These mushrooms smell as bad as they look." The weeks came closer. Then, without warning, a shower of spears flew out of the mine, but they fell harmlessly between the two bodies of the army. The first mushrooms emerged, choking from the mine. "Cut them down! Death to the invaders!" Swords leaped and swirled and slashed like tongues of flame as the Minipins closed in. The slaughter was great that early, dewy morning. When the sun rose over the Sunset Mountains, plumes of smoke still drifted out of the old mine, but the work of the warriors was finished. Their swords were black now and heavy in their hands. They went about the sober business of gathering the bodies of the dead mushrooms into a great pile. Wood was brought for the funeral pyre, but Litted stayed the hands of those who would light it. "Let us wait until we can go into the mountain to find Minji," he said. "There may be more mushrooms within to add to the pyre." "Litted speaks wisely," said Walter the Earl. He watched the last wisps of smoke emerge from the mouth of the mine. "I want 10 warriors to enter the mountain with me." Every warrior stepped forward. But just then, they heard a cheerful voice singing. Out of tune, it is true, but the words were clear. It was Gummy's spring song. "Bright sunshine, blue flowers, pink rainbows, moisty showers, spring ting-a-ling, ting-a-ling, spring." Minji emerged from the mountain. His sand-colored cloak was askew, and he only wore one slipper, but his face was wreathed in a happy smile. Clasped in his arms was a big metal pot. "Good morning," he cried, "for I see it is a good morning. Is there anything for breakfast?" All right, we're going to start the final chapter here momentarily. Hello, everybody. I do love Minji just... Oh, hey, what's up, guys? What's for breakfast? Okay. Here we go. Chapter 26. Hail, all hail to our outlaws bold. They braved the forest and the mountains old, and drove the mushrooms from our fold with their mighty swords of shimmering gold. Oh hail to our outlaws bold. Whim, scribble in honor of the 5 heroes. Messages were sent back to the knoll and to Slipper on the Water. With them went the metal pot of white salve, which Minji had brought out of the mushroom's cavern. But first, Litted had smeared some of the precious substance on the warriors who had been wounded in the pursuit to the mountain. Walter the Earl chose 10 mini pins to enter the old mines and search for more mushrooms to add to the funeral pyre. But Minji, though invited to lead the way, declined with thanks. You only have to follow your nose, he said. As for me, it'll be a long spell of famine before I ever eat another mushroom. Walter the Earl and his 10 chosen men were inside the mountain all morning, and when they emerged at last, they carried 3 chests of gold, ore which they had found in another cavern beyond the one Minji had inhabited. They reported the entire length of the mine clear of mushrooms. We rolled great stones into the entrance at the other end, Walter the Earl told Litted. Was that the right thing to do? Litted nodded his head. He hesitated and then asked, What was it like? There on the other side of the mountain. Gray, said Walter the Earl. Gray and flat as far as the eye could see. No trees or grass or anything stirring. There was water trickling down the mountain, but it was sour and brackish. Not a pleasant land beyond the mountains. He turned to look over the green valley, now bathed in sunlight. There may be lands like ours somewhere in the world, but I shall never seek them. Nor I. Litted looked dreamily over the waving green trees of the land between the mountains. Tell me, what did your ancient scrolls say about Fooley's journey? Walter the Earl hesitated before answering, and then said slowly, It was an accident. The balloon was made by a clever toy maker for a fun fair. But Fooley got into it before it was tied fast, and when he threw out the sandbags, he went sailing over the mountain. I see, said Litted thoughtfully. How he got back is a mystery, except that the mini-pins of the time called it fool's luck. And he did bring back the things that are in the museum, and he did crash when he landed, but it wasn't the crash that addled his brain. He was a very simple mini-pin, though a brave one. I see, said Litted again. I'm sorry, said Walter the Earl. Nobody need know, of course. You are wrong. We periods have been overproud these many years, but we believe in justice when we recognize it. Litted winced. The painting and the family tree, were they really mixed? Yes, but it doesn't matter, Walter the Earl assured him. Before Fooley came back, there were no trees in villages because they made the place untidy with their falling leaves. So, you see, it was a good thing after all. How could we do without our family trees? Crambo came running up to them. The funeral pyre is lit, and the army is ready to march home. But they only went as far as the knoll that afternoon. At Litted's insistence, they rested there for the remainder of the day and that night. Litted sent off another messenger by boat, but nobody heard what the message was. Thanks to the white salve brought out of the cavern by Minji, the wounded men were all better. Minji hobbled discontinently. Minji hobbled discontinently about. I can't read the sentence. Sorry. Minji hobbled about among the chattering warriors who had flung off their armor and were resting in the clean spring air. He didn't want to go back to Slipper on the Water. That was the trouble. At least, he didn't want to go back to being alone again in his bare little house with only a money box for company. Oh, of course, he had friends now, and Litted had talked at length about the sick fund while they were marching back from the mountain, but he thought about that day he and Muggles had shared the turtle soup and fresh loaf in her cozy cottage. It had been a happy dinner for him. If only Muggles felt the same way. He stopped short, frowning down at Thatch, who was stretched out against a tree, sucking blissfully on a clove of garlic. But how did he know that she didn't? I'll ask her, he exclaimed. What? Asked Thatch. I said I'll ask her, Minji repeated. Of course. Thatch watched him walking fast toward the roofless house and scratched his head. Of course, he said. Of course. Inside the house, Gummy railed at Muggles and Curly Green and Walter the Earl. Can't you tell I'm perfectly well, he grumbled. 'Twas the merest scratch, only needing a patch. You don't get up until we say so, retorted Muggles. You almost blinked out on us last night, and if Minji hadn't discovered the white salve, you wouldn't be reciting your rhymes right now. So hush your noise. A tyrant, Gummy complained. A bossy, meddling tyrant you are, Muggles. He smiled fondly at her. Not that I'm not grateful. If I'd have died, I'd always keep wondering how it had all turned out. It's time for your hot broth, said Curly Green. You can have a trout toasted for tea if you behave yourself. She still looked a little white, but the salve had healed the bump on her head, where the spear had struck her helmet the night before. Walter the Earl gave a stern nod of his head. "You do just what these two tell you, or I'll send you home by boat tomorrow instead of letting you march with the army." Gummy returned to his grumbling, somewhat strained through mouthfuls of broth. When Minchie poked his head around the door, Gummy waved him in with his spoon. "I'm making you a scribble, but it's not finished yet. It goes, 'Down in the mountain where the mushrooms repose, lay Minchie the fearless, holding his nose.'" Minchie scarcely heard him. "Look here, are we all going back to slip around the water?" As they stared at him blankly, he added in his old gruff way, "What I mean is, too bad after all the work we've done to this place. Wasteful. And then there's all that gold going to waste in the mountain. Ought to do something with it. Gold thread, gold cups, things like that." Walter the Earl frowned. "I've promised Litid to translate the ancient manuscripts for the village." "I don't know," Curly Green said hesitantly, looking at Gummy. "We've been talking about it. We thought perhaps it would be fun to live in both places. When we get restless in the village, we can come here for a week or two. Or maybe for the summer." "Taking a wife may lead to strife," Gummy interrupted with a grin. "On the other hand, it might be grand, and not so lonely as on your only." "Oh," Minji scowled. "Well, congratulations, I suppose. You don't want me around cluttering up the knoll. Now, if I had a wife and we fixed the roof on this place, well, never mind." He wheeled to go out, but at the doorway he paused and spoke over his shoulder. "Too cantankerous myself. To get me a wife, I mean. Good thing, too, I shouldn't wonder. Married folks waste time. All the talking they do when—" "Minji." Muggle's voice was so soft that he wouldn't have heard it if he hadn't been waiting for her to speak. He turned with his most ferocious scowl. "Well," he snapped, "speak up. Don't waste time. Got work to do." "You haven't got a thing to do," Muggle said stoutly, "and you'd better come back here and let me dress your foot properly. And so as not to waste your cantankerous time, I'll tell you right out that if you want a wife, I'm it." Minji leaned against the doorway, his cheeks glowing pink with happiness and relief. "Well," he said, "that's all settled then. Soon as my foot gets better, put a roof over our heads. Get it done next week, shouldn't wonder. No sense in wasting time. Suppose you'll want an orange door or some such nonsense. Waste of paint if you ask me, but more of a waste of breath to argue about it." And he hobbled back into the room toward Muggles, a slow, happy smile spreading over his face. It was the middle of the next morning before Walter the Earl led his victorious army of 50 into the marketplace of Slipper-on-the-Water to the welcoming cheers of the women and children. Banners waved and the trumpets sounded. Garlands of spring flowers stretched from one end of the square to the other. The sun glinted off helmets and struck 1,000 winking fires from the warriors' jeweled cloaks. Another cheer welled up from every Minnie-Pin throat, and another and another. The very cobblestones rang with the joyful sound. "Hail to the heroes! Welcome home! Hail Walter the Earl! Hail Muggles and Minji! Hail Curly Green and Gummy! Welcome home!" Muggles clutched Minji's hand in bewilderment. "Look," she whispered. "Look!" But Minji was already looking everywhere at once. The brave banners furling in the spring breeze bore names, the outlaws' names. Colored streamers of scarlet and orange and yellow and blue and gold fluttered from every house. And the doors. There wasn't a green door on the square. All glowed with rainbow hues. "Pinch me," said Curly Green to Gummy, and then, as he obediently obliged her, "Ow!" Walter the Earl gave an order, and the army suddenly stopped being an army and became Minnie-Pin's home safe after the battle. Wives flew to embrace husbands, and children clamored joyfully over their father's armor until such a deafening clamor arose that it sounded like another battle. Then everybody embraced the outlaws and talked and laughed until the tears came, and talked and cried until they broke into laughter again. In the midst of this scene, 3 strangers appeared from the street going to the river. Nobody noticed them at all, although they walked among the throng, listening to a phrase here, a sentence there, and exchanging glances as they slowly began to understand what had happened. When the noise had subsided, Litid stepped up on a box in the middle of the marketplace. Dingle and Thrum, seeing what he was about, gave 3 blasts on their trumpets, at which the strangers almost jumped out of their skins. The hubbub of the square stopped, as though it had been choked off. "Good people," said Litid. Our brave army has returned victorious after slaying more than 300 mushrooms. We are proud of them. Some there were who could not fight because there was not enough armor or swords, but these tended the wounded and carried supplies and messages. We are just as proud of them. But there are 5 of our number who, after being wrongfully treated by some of us and driven out of the village, for they were driven out in spite of the fact that they outlawed themselves to save our faces. Where was I? Yes, these 5, though they had no reason to love their village, saved us from certain destruction. We are the proudest of all of these 5. A mighty cheer swelled from the throng. Litid raised his hand. Good people, when I say some of us, I am referring to myself and the rest of those you call periods, the descendants of Fuli the Magnificent. He gave a wry smile before going on. I have only just learned that this great ancestor of ours was anything but magnificent. According to certain ancient scrolls, which Walter the Earl, at my request, has contended to place in the museum, Fuli's voyage to the land beyond the mountains was no more than a foolish prank. He didn't make the balloon, he only stole a ride in it at a fun fair. There were shocked gasps of disbelief, but Litid silenced them with another wave of his hand. So you see that the mayor of your village, who has borne himself much too proudly, is really the descendant of a fool, for that was his true name. Good folk, I thought to bring you the Gammage Cup, but instead I have ruined your chances of winning it. I am sorry. I can only make some small amends now by resigning my office as mayor of Slipper on the Water. In the stunned silence that greeted Litid stepping down from the box, Ko's voice rang out. Litid makes himself too much to blame. It was I who tried to outlaw our good friends, not Litid. And I, cried Geo and Wim together. One moment, thundered Walter the Earl. He sprang onto the box, his jeweled cloak flashing in the sun. We have had differences in the past, but when danger threatened, we found that there was no difference in our hearts. Litid is a great and good mayor. He says he has lost us the Gammage Cup, and I say, what does it matter? If we are happy in our own way, in our own village, do we need the Gammage Cup? No, shouted the villagers. But I am not the one to talk to you, Walter the Earl went on. I say, let us hear from one of our villagers, who always sees the plain sense of things. I say, let Muggles come forward, and tell us what she thinks. Muggles gasped as a new cheer went up. Me? She looked round for help, but many hands were pushing her toward the box, and she found herself mounted there over the heads of the crowd without a word to say. Pretend you're just trying to drive us to work, Gummy whispered up to her. Go on, Muggles, we're all your friends. Good friends, Muggles faltered, and stuck there for a moment until she caught Curly Green's smiling gaze. Good friends. I once said we weren't all the same color inside, but I know now that I was wrong. At least, well, the night of the battle, we were all the very same color, a sort of shimmering gold, like the ancient writing on the swords. Of course, that was a big, important thing. We couldn't go on having shimmering inside every day, or we would wear ourselves out. We're like the swords, in a way. Sort of black and ugly looking when we're just going along from day to day and making each other angry over little things. But we ought to remember that way deep inside us there is a little flickering glow. And go on, Muggles, urged Minji. You're talking sense. Muggles lifted a fold of her orange cloak and began pleating it nervously between her fingers. About Fuli, I don't know, but it seems to me, well, he lived 440 years ago, and it makes no difference what we thought of him yesterday or what we think of him today. He was exactly what he was, and nobody could change him by thinking. So I don't see how it can work backwards either. I mean, Litid is what he is, no matter what Fuli was like. It's not Fuli we elected mayor anyway, it was Litid. So that's all I have to say, except that I don't think we need the Gammage Cup. Our village is what it is, no matter what the 3 judges think of us. And for us, it's the best village in the land between the mountains. We don't need a Gammage Cup to tell us so. The villagers cheered wildly as she stepped down off the box. Thrum and Dingle blew great trumpet fanfares on their trumpets. Banners waved and streamers fluttered. "Hail, Muggles! Here's to our village! Hail, Litted, our great mayor!" Then somebody struck up a song. "Here's to our mayor, good Litted the fair, Litted the wise with far-seeing eyes, oh here's to Litted the rare." Hands were joined, and the singing, dancing villagers began to weave in and out about the marketplace, round the museum, past supplies, circling the mayor's house and Foley Hall. At the end of the eel parade, Finn, the oldest inhabitant, cavorted with all the vigor and joy of little Co, who was next in line. Muggles found her hand in the friendly clasp of her neighbor Aang, and further along came Geo and Curly Green, Wim and Gummy. Walter the Earl and Mingy were drawn into the dance by Co and Bros. Round and round went the villagers over the cobblestones, and then Finn led them out to the little road going nowhere to dance in the green meadow beyond the village. When the marketplace was empty, the three strangers looked at each other, and then looked down at the thing they carried, wrapped in purest reed silk. "This is the last of the villages we have to visit," said the first. "There was no welcoming celebration for us like those in the other 10 villages," said the second. "They never even saw us, so wrapped up were they in their affairs." "They have had great trouble here," said the third. The first nodded gravely. "But they are no longer troubled. Who knows what secrets were hidden from us by the other villages?" The second rubbed his chin with a thoughtful forefinger. "They don't really need the Gammage cup. You heard what the one called Muggles said." The third took off his hat and then replaced it carefully. "But the terms of the contest say nothing about needing or not needing. It's all in the deserving." They stood silent in the marketplace, looking about at the banners and streamers and garlands, and the bright doors of the little white thatched cottages. From the meadow beyond came the joyful voices of the villagers in song after song. "The village is what it is," remarked the first suddenly. "Nothing was hidden from us." "It will be good to get back to Water Splash," said the second with a sigh. "I am tired of gala dinners and speeches," exclaimed the third. "Let us steal away quietly while the good folks are celebrating. We will never be missed." They stayed a few minutes longer in the deserted but happy-looking marketplace, and then they hurried away down the street going to the river, their green cloaks billowing in the empty road. But on the box in the center of the marketplace, glimmering and glowing in the afternoon sun, so that the reflection of its light touched every cottage door, stood the Gammage cup. And I did cry at the end. Oh, all right. Thank you so much to everyone who has joined us. This has been a very lovely experience going through everything. I'm going to try to continue reading. There is a follow-up book to this book called The Whisper of Glocken. And I'm not sure if I'm going to read that one. It's not as exciting as this one. But I do have it. So I'm not sure if I'll read that one or if maybe we'll read another series. I was looking at my bookshelf and kind of trying to figure out what I wanted to read. I think I might do another sort of like young adult series. Whether that's, I've thought about Percy Jackson maybe, or maybe another one that I have from when I was younger. But I will be back next week with something. I will post on Facebook and on Instagram what I'm planning on reading once I figure it out, hopefully before next week. And we can and you can come by if you would like. So same time next week, Tuesday, 8:00 Eastern time. Thank you to everyone who joined us. And I hope to see you again soon. Bye.